You winning, son? Because I did. A reasonable amount. Anyway, I didn't win like the whole thing. But I won enough to slap a top 8 on this video. So, you know, you probably clicked on it just for that. This is empty. There's this. Hello, everyone. It's me, your dad. So, Houston BSF was this past weekend, and I have finally broken my curse of ending up at seat 8 in the final round and making a dumb gameplay choice that cost me getting into top 8. The curse is broken, finally made it to top 8. Now we gotta work on getting past that. But hey, it was my third event overall, my third time playing premium at an event, and it went pretty well. I'm happy to at least have gotten into that illustrious chair box that they make around the top cut tables. Now, like every previous premium event I have played in, I have brought Victor. Victor, I feel like, is in a very interesting spot in the current meta, just because it has such a favorable matchup to Order Colony. And that's why I was kind of playing Victor. One, I was playing Victor because I love Victor, and 2, I was playing Victor because of that matchup. Back in Atlanta, one of my teammates actually played Order Colony, and it was him that I playtested the most against to get used to that matchup, and I have never lost a single Order Colony game since then. Well, actually, that's not true. I did get sacked out in Houston to an Overtrigger and a crit while on grade 2. That sucked. What can you do? We will be going over my list that I have played in both BSFs, both Atlanta and Houston. This is also the list that I've been playing for the last several months. I want to say most of this year. This is what my testing has led to and what I've been playing, and it's been performing really, really well. But I will also try and go into some alternate options you can run, and also just kind of break down Victor as a whole in this video. So if you just want the list, deck log is in the description. I'm not gonna waste too much of your time because you either want to hear me talk or you don't. If you want to hear me talk though, buckle up. So when it comes to playing Nova Grappler in Premium, especially playing Victor, I feel like there are 2 main playstyles to go into. The main 2 options are focusing our build to go into Bustard as much as possible, or focusing our build to go more into Asdabulk instead. Now, when Asdabulk first came out, a lot of people were very critical of the card, and for the life of me, I could not understand why. It is Counterblast 1 to restand your front row. In what world is that not a good Nova Grappler card? Now, my list that we'll get here to in a second is a very greedy list, because not only does it try to abuse Asdabulk as much as possible, but also Bustard whenever the opportunity presents itself. And it's actually kind of interesting because more often than not, if we're going into Bustard, we're behind and we're trying to catch up. We're not using Bustard as a way to end or finish the game, although we most certainly can. It's just that more often than not, we just use Bustard and his ridiculous amount of drive checks to draw a bunch of cards. Now that could also just come down to my trigger luck, which is notorious for being bad. In fact, I think I even went into a Bustard turn in the final round of Swiss and flipped up 7 blanks. So that's me. If you have different luck than I do, maybe Bustard is better for you than this. But more often than not, I find that just going into Asdabulk and just getting bunch of attacks tends to be better for me in the long run. With all that said though, let's actually get into the list and take a look at that. So here we are in deck log, and here is the list. Starting off, we're going to talk about the main boy himself, Extreme Battler Victor, the VR. And you will notice that he is the only, well, not really the only grade 3 we're running, but basically the only grade 3 that we're running. Back in my previous Victor list, I was actually focusing more on Zubat Battler Victor. Now, Zubat Battler Victor is still an amazing card, and it's kind of cool that they reprinted it back in Revival Selection. In fact, I've even seen some lists just from this past weekend running Zubat Battler Victor as a one of, and that is certainly an option, and you could totally do that. In fact, maybe I'll start doing that from here on, just because of the way that this deck is kind of built. But really, with the way the format has changed in the year and a half since I posted my last Victor video, this Victor is way too important. Getting the marker is way too important. And honestly, his on-play skill is a godsend in this deck. Sure, Zubat Battler Victor has the skill that when he's stride, you can counterblast one, draw a card, call a card, give something on the board, and on attack restand. This is a great skill. It's great for Bustard, especially because it's one extra restand you have on the board to proc his skill and to build up that mass amount of drive checks. Victor's on ride skill to check the top 7 cards of the deck and call and a grade 2 or less extreme battler to the board is honestly invaluable in this deck. Rather than getting just a blind draw with Zubat, we can kind of choose what our advantage is. Sure, we don't get the extra restand, but I don't think that's too important right now, especially with the way I play this deck. Victor also having the ability to restand something on his attack and getting an extra drive check if that unit stood 2 or more times is also actually really good, and a lot of times it's sometimes depending on your matchup, which that is something to be said too. If you want to do well with Nova Grappler and this meta, you need to know your matchups and how to play around them. And honestly, it works out a lot because most people don't know how to play around you because most people don't know what Nova Grappler cards do for some reason. I have had games where I've just ridden up to Victor and killed my opponent on a grade 3 turn with Victor just because they never hit any defensives and just couldn't stand up to all the attacks that we pumped out. Granted, there's a bit of sacking involved in that, but the opportunity can present itself, and it's important to be able to take advantage of that when it comes up. Other than that though, I think that's about all I can say about Extreme Battler Victor. Going into our grade 2s, we are going to talk about probably, in my opinion, one of the most important cards in the deck besides Victor himself, and that's Cool Hank. Now, back in my last Victor list, I was not running Cool Hank. I was actually kind of dismissive of Cool Hank. Back in those days, I was so laser focused on going into Bustard and proccing Bustard as many times as possible that I never even considered Cool Hank. I think I mentioned him as an option you could run, but that has completely changed because now that we don't necessarily focus on Bustard as much, sure, we go into Bustard when the opportunity presents itself, don't get me wrong, but Cool Hank is such an important card, and it is honestly the card that we want to ride on grade 2 turn every single game. Now, this will change a little bit once the Zonda comes out. We'll have another viable target for a grade 2 ride that will still net us some advantage. But Cool Hank's Vanguard skill to on hit, Soul Blast 1 and draw is so invaluable. Do not be afraid to use your soul in this deck for things other than Bustard. It is honestly worth it. If you are on Hank, you can kind of grade 2 game your opponent. Sure, you're not really pumping out like a bunch of aggression or anything, but if the matchup calls for it, chances are your opponent isn't probably pumping out that much aggression to you either. And even if they are, with Heal Guardians being a thing now, we can if we have a couple of those in hand, we can safely sit on Cool Hank for an extra turn, sometimes 2. Depends on how just aggressively your opponent wants to fight for first stride. Because of his on-hit skill, though, it makes it so that if we hit, we draw a card and we're not really missing out by not riding up to grade 3 and getting that twin drive. And if our opponent blocks it to keep him from hitting, then we're still minusing our opponent 1 and still netting the same amount of advantage. And of course, his rear guard skill that when he attacks, we can discard a card, stand on our other rear guards is also pretty important. We don't usually go into it unless we absolutely have to. We have other ways of restanding in this deck, but Cool Hank just costing a discard means that we can't be damage denied. And a lot of people, if they have like kind of an idea of what Nova Grappler does, they will try and CB deny you, and this just makes it so that they can't do that. Next up, we have Extreme Battler Dosledge. Now, Dosledge has been a way to cheese games from opponents for a while now, at least with the way I play him. He has an ascending number of skills that each trigger based on how many times he stood during the turn. First time he gets 10k, second time he soul charges 1, which is great for busted turns. And then on the third restand, he gets another 10k and a Sentinel restrict. Unfortunately, right now this is kind of one of our win cons, is just sit here and restand Dose Ledge over and over again. And sometimes we can kind of kill our opponent just by riding up to Victor if we're able to get a Dose Ledge on board. Just because if our opponent only has one Heal Guardian, well, he's probably just gonna swing over it. And if we're able to restand him the 3 times and happen to check a crit on Victor's triple drive, which isn't entirely unheard of, we can kind of just sack an opponent out of the game just by riding up. Obviously, that kind of depends on what pieces we have in hand when we do that, but Dose Ledge just works really, really well. Some lists I've seen will run Brutal Jack in this space instead, and running Brutal Jack is perfectly fine. Brutal Jack having the rest 2 to restand himself skill is great for Bustard, especially if you're going heavy in on Bustard. But the main reason I've gone for Dose Ledge here over something like Brutal Jack is purely because he has the Extreme Battler name, which means that he is a target to hit off of Extreme Battler Victor. Victor's on-ride skill, like I said earlier, is very, very crucial in this deck because we can kind of find ourselves with like a bunch of pieces in hand, but we're just missing that one thing. And a lot of times we can kind of hit it with Extreme Battler Victor by seeing it off the top 7 of our deck. Top 7 is a pretty deep dive into our deck, especially at the stage in the game with the amount of draws we can tend to do. More often than not, we'll hit the piece that we need, and that is just so important right now. Other than that, not much else to say about Dose Ledge here. It's just unfortunate that he's likely going to be cut once Sazanda comes out. Next, we have Extreme Battler Golshachi. Golshachi is fantastic. He is basically a kick typhoon, but only for Victor, and also has resist. And that natural built-in resist comes in pretty handy pretty often. It does make him a target for our opponent to try and swing at because they can't pop them or lock him or rest him and things like that. But sometimes that's okay because with the amount of drawing that we can kind of do with this build, chances are we'll just have another one in hand, and that's really kind of handy. A lot of times once you build a really wide board, your opponent might think, oh, I can just swing at his rear guards, I'll damage deny him, and then he can't actually push back when it goes back to his turn. Not always true. Sometimes, sure, that can be true, but more often than not, if things are going our way anyways, we probably have extra copies of cards in hand to fill Golshachi's place and the other pieces on board, and we can't always be damage denied either. So really good. His rush skill is pretty handy too, just that when he restands at GB2 he gets plus 7k. Can be kind of relevant, just makes him a 16k beat stick. Not the magic number that it used to be anymore, unfortunately, but you know what, it's better than nothing. And not to mention we have ways of raising that power even higher, so getting that plus 7k can become pretty relevant pretty quickly. Next, we'll move on to our grade 2s, and we'll actually start with talking about our PG Extreme Battler Baryon. Now, Baryon is a really good card and also not a really good card at the same time. It's kind of a mixed bag. It's mixed in that he can only PG Victor, which is something that I can forget sometimes, embarrassingly. Just because in the stress of a moment, you're like, it's a Sentinel PG, but don't worry about it. More often than not, we can tend to survive the early game based on the virtue of our heal guards and things like that. But Baryon is so good just because at the end of his battle, we can counterblast 1 and draw a card. This combos really well with a couple of our G Guardians to basically make this free. And also just more drawing is really good, especially during our opponent's turn, because we can find ourselves in really dicey situations. And then we guard with Baryon, discard something, draw something back, and that one thing we draw might be the thing that means surviving to another turn or having the piece that we need to kill on our next turn. So really, really like Baryon. This is honestly pretty flexible, especially if you don't like the restriction to only guarding Victor. You can run Violate Dragon here, which can sometimes come up and be just as relevant, because instead of drawing a card, you just don't have to discard. You know, so there's something there, I suppose. I was also kind of running or testing out Headstrong Battle at some points. Headstrong Battle's interesting, and there's kind of like a funky kind of jank combo you could do with Headstrong Battle, but I just decided it wasn't worth it. You could also just run countercharge PGs if you really want to. All these things are totally worth running potentially in place of something like this if this just doesn't mesh with your playstyle. Next, we will talk about Extreme Battler Ganbaru Gun. Ganbaru Gun is another one of the new Extreme Battler cards that I believe I was running less copies of back in my previous Victor list. It's been a long time since I've played that version of this list. And it was kind of iffy to me. It's great that he's a 10k shield, but now my opinion has like completely changed, and this is one of the more important cards in the deck now. You can bump this up from 3 to 4 very easily. I run a lot of different grade 1s in this deck just because of Victor being able to check the top 7 and add something. So more often than not, you can kind of find the piece you need. I can't tell you, like I've mentioned it a couple times already, but I can't tell you how many times I've been one piece short and I just find it off of Victor. It's really that good. Ganbaru Gun is so perfect though, just because he's a Soul Blast to restand, so can't be damage denied. You can run your soul a little bit too low, but you know, that's more on you to manage that. And he gets plus 5k until end of turn, so he becomes a 13k, which is extremely relevant for hitting force numbers. You slap him on XL2, he's an 18k, and then all of a sudden your opponent's force Vanguard cannot drop a 5k shield to block him. He's definitely worthy of being run at 4. I'm just not right now because I'm trying to cram a lot of different things into this deck. Next up, we're going to talk about Extreme Battler Gerald Hawk. Gerald Hawk is a card that I consider a busted card, and is why I crammed in at least 3. It was at 2, but I ended up shuffling around some triggers and PGs to make room for a third one, just so that way I could go into busted that much more often. Because if you are going into your stride turn and you have 2 Gerald Hawks in hand, it's probably worth going into busted at that point, because Gerald Hawk on his own is a busted proc. He stands something, goes to soul, draws you a card, and then you have the restand and the soul needed to activate busted skill to get more drive checks. Super important, at least for those busted turns. And he also gives a thing, he stood plus 2k, not always the most relevant, but sometimes it can come up. Next, we will talk about Extreme Battler Malyaki. If Gerald Hawk is a busted card, Malyaki is an Asdabulk card. He will be your best friend and partner in crime to Doe Sledge, because you park one of these behind a Doe Sledge, you restand that Doe Sledge over and over and over, and Malyaki gives that Doe Sledge the skill that whenever it attacks, it gives 2 things plus 4k. Important to note is that this skill is not once per turn. So the first restand, you give 2 things 4k. Second restand, 4 things 4k. Third restand, 6, so on and so forth. If you have an opponent that is just got some annoying numbers, or they keep hitting a bunch of damage triggers, or they got a ton of cards in hand, not anymore. You will eat through them like crazy. The first 4k, you slap that onto a Doe Sledge, you're now a 23k beat stick. And then the more you do that, the more you basically just create harder and harder situations for your opponent to guard, which is really where we kind of need to shine in this deck. This is only going to get better once Sazanda comes out. You can potentially drop Malyaki to run Sazanda, or you can run both Malyaki and Sazanda and then just get really nutty with the power, and then damage triggers will no longer be the bane of your existence. Next, we will talk about Extreme Battler Gunsden. Gunsden, I am running at 2 copies just because this is really meta reliant. Gunsden is a really important card, and I don't see myself running it in any Nova Grappler deck, especially one that's trying to be competitive at less than 2. With things like Denial Griffin, Narukami's G-Guards, I don't care about Narukami. Nubatama can rip away your back row. You know, there's so many things that can happen. Genesis has that little wizard guy that like basically header arounds you. All these are things that can completely interrupt and ruin what could be a very heavy aggressive push or potentially a kill turn. And Gunsden, you rest him and you give 5 things resist. Usually you'll have a Golshachi on board, so you can just give everything else resist, and then you can usually rest pretty easy. He also has the skill that when he stands, he gets plus 4k for every face-up card in your G zone. So we can kind of turbo to GB8 in Nova Grappler, and then he can become a really amazing beat stick if all else fails. So that's kind of important to keep in mind as well. Next, we have 3 copies of the original Extreme Battler Arashid. If there's one change I seriously thought about making between Atlanta and Houston, it was running a 2-2 split of the new Arashid and the old. I ended up just sticking with the build I had, and I think that's fine. It's perfectly fine to run the old Arashid. I'm just personally not a very big fan of those V grade 3 searchers, especially in a deck like this where I've only got Victor and the Heal Guardian. I basically just want to make sure that I always have Victor, and across Atlanta and Houston, I always did. And if I didn't, I was able to use Arashid and the Heal Guardian to get it to my hand. This is also incredibly important for the Order Colony matchup, because the one thing that Order Colony can do to you to make you just completely shut down is stunning your Vanguard. If you can't stand your Vanguard, that's where you're kind of screwed. So it's really important to be able to get multiple copies of Victor into hand, so that way, whatever the Order Colony player does, it's basically nothing, because we just re-ride into a Victor, have a stud Vanguard, and then probably stride as the bulk and restand our front row anyways. So for that reason, I felt fine keeping the 3 copies of the original Arashid. That being said, feel free to run both. Feel free to run one over the other, whichever fits you the most. But this also functioning as stride fodder is also really kind of important. A lot of these stride fodder grade 1s I've been running in a lot of my G-themed decks, especially now with Heal Guardians, and especially in decks where we run maybe just a single grade 3, or we just have one grade 3 that we want to ride into, and I've been having a lot of success with that. Maybe you're a different story, but I'm really happy with this right now. Next, we'll go into our triggers. First, let's go ahead and talk about Heal Guardians. We all know Heal Guardians. I don't know why Nova's is a dragon. It's, you know, that is what it is. They keep giving us dragons. At least Merciless Dragon is cool. Next, we'll talk about the 1 copy of Extreme Battler Break Pass, the Crit Sentinel. I basically dropped a 4th Baryon to fit in a 3rd Gerald Hawk, and I didn't want to lose any crits. I believe I said it in my last Victor video, but it is very important to have crits on your drive checks, because if you don't have crits, things just kind of fall flat. Stands are great too, obviously, but those are mostly for Bustard. You can also run the original Break Pass. I've been seeing that happen a lot as well. I'm just already running 4 5k triggers and don't really want to have any more 5k triggers in this deck, because that really kind of hurts, unfortunately. Next, we have 4 copies of our Stride Crit. We're only running 4 Victors, and ideally we want to ride 1, 2, maybe even 3 of them sometimes, at least probably 1 or 2, and we don't want to have to be discarding them for striding, so running the Arashid and the Kitten Pickin for stride fodder, really great, and we also don't really want to be discarding our Heal Guardians for that, because we want them to, you know, help us survive the early game in G-Guard, all that. Next up, we have 2 copies of Magnagos 2502. It's just a 10k crit, and sometimes the skill to put him into the soul and draw a card, get 10k in your Vanguard, can be relevant, mainly for Bustard turns, just to get some extra soul, but that's not always necessary. Just kind of comes up, sometimes it doesn't. And then 4 copies of Extreme Battler Kachiwall. Kachiwall is fantastic for Bustard as well. This could also be Energy Girl, especially if you're probably focusing more on Asdabulk rather than trying to do both like I am, just because he's an extender. He turns 1 stand into 2, and that's 2 more drive checks on Bustard, which is really good. He also draws us a card. So a lot of cards in this deck, just rear guards, they just give us cards in hand, which is pretty relevant as well. And lastly, we have the Overtrigger. It's an Overtrigger. The Brant Gate one, I think, is probably the best one to run. Sure, you could probably try and run the Cray Elemental one, especially for a budget option, because, you know, an Overtrigger is an Overtrigger, right? This one can just sometimes randomly sack people out of games because they say no guard, and then you hit a crit, and then you hit this, and then you hit them for 4 damage all of a sudden. Not to mention the fact that you slap the 100 million on a Dose Ledge, and then it doubles to 200 million, and then even if your opponent hits their Overtrigger on that turn, still pretty much GG's at that point. That does it for the main deck. Now we are going to take a look at the G deck. I've spent the entire video talking about these 2 cards. Let's just get them out of the way. Universe Ace Bustard. Oh, I love this card. I love this card so much. I have done people so dirty with this card. And I've also flipped up nothing but blanks with this card. So, like has been mentioned probably a dozen times in this video, when something restands Soul Blast 1, turn a G-Zone card face up, gets a drive check. Now, like I said, I tend to use this more as a card to plus with rather than a finisher. That's not to be said that it can't be used as a finisher. It certainly can, but it's just usually the least optimal finisher in this deck compared to other things that we have. And then, of course, if his drive's 5 or more, you can discard 3 and restand him. He loses 5 drive. In this build, you will rarely probably get above 7. Maybe you'll see 8 sometimes. That can definitely happen every now and again. But more often than not, if you're going to Bustard turn, you want to see at least 7, just so that way if you do decide to restand him, you get Twin Drive and you're only kind of like discarding 1 card after drawing like 7. But this is all very well and good. I was running this at 2, but for terms of going to Springfest, I just found myself not going into it as much, and I was trying to make some meta calls as well, so I made the hard choice to cut them down to 1, and that seemed to be plenty, because honestly, if I got 1 Bustard off, I was pretty much set after that. And then next, Asdabulk. Again, another card I've talked about this entire video. Vanguard Circle, when it attacks, Counterblast 1, flip up something, and then you stand your front row, and he gets plus 5k for everything that stood. This creates some very nutty turns, especially if you're able to have a Malyaki Dose Ledge column and 2 Restanders as a 9 attack turn, and potentially you can get more off to be able to, depending on what Excel markers you have, to get more Restands on Dose Ledge to where he locks your opponent out of Sentinels and you can just kind of kill him. You hit a crit on his drive check, slap it on Dose Ledge. I've gone over it before. It's really good. This I'm running at a 2 of, just because more often than not, like, we'll first stride this, and then if we second stride, unless we have GB8 or a way to like go into a solid Bustard turn, it's usually just better going into another Asdabulk. Next, we have 1 copy of Winning Champ Victor. Winning Champ Victor can be relevant in certain matchups if we really, really need to get around some power, and he's also one of our best ways to deal with something like Hanali. Once Hazanda comes out, I believe Winning Champ is probably going to become that much more desirable, because then everything that restands will be getting a 10k buff, and then we can just kind of beat our opponent down out of the game that way. But for the most part right now, this is our main way to deal with Hanali. Believe in Atlanta, I had a very intense game against somebody playing Grand Blue, and I used this to pop their Hanali, and then like 2 attacks later, they were able to call the Hanali back to board, which is like, wow. Still in that game though. So I would consider Bustard, Winning Champ, and Asdabulk basically our main first stride options that we can go into, and then from there it's just kind of like our alternate options. I am running Sea Breeze in this list. This actually, It never came up. It came very close to coming up, but in testing, it could come up sometimes, and so I felt comfortable having the option. The main reason I have this in the deck is because of the Nightmare Doll matchup. If you are playing this deck and going up against Nightmare Dolls, it is pretty important to basically hard damage deny them so that ideally they don't get the ride down, and then you can kind of grade 2 game them, or at least grade 2 stall on them, and if they try to do the same back to you, well, then that's your cue to just ride up to Victor, stride Sabreeze to turn on your Malyakis, because at that point, Malyaki is getting over Heal Guardians. Malyaki's buff that he gives will help you get past those Heal Guardians, and that's why I decided to run Sabreeze, is for that matchup alone. And then at that point, potentially we could minus our opponent enough and beat them down enough to where we can significantly lessen what their aggression would be, and then just kind of come back and on the crackback take them out. Never really came up though, because in the entirety of both Atlanta and Houston, I dodged Nightmare Dolls. I did not dodge Order Colony, which is exactly what I wanted. For the most part, I believe every team that had an Order Colony player, I was against them, which is exactly what I wanted. Next, we have Meteor Kaiser Victor. Meteor Kaiser Victor is our damage deny option. Came up a couple of times just when people decided to hard damage deny me. And at that point, it's like, you don't really have much other option. And then we also have 2 copies of Victoplasma. Victoplasma is another kind of weird option that we can go into to try and deal with Hanali, especially if we've already used our winning champ, or we've flipped up winning champ or something like that, just because we can swing with our rear guards, get our 4 attacks with rear guards, and then just swing the last 2 times with our Vanguard. That is sometimes a decent play. Never really came up, thankfully, and this could probably get cut. Maybe this is the spot to put in Merciless Dragon. I feel like this deck is pretty plug and play friendly with Merciless Dragon, and he's just a solid option for this deck just to get additional Vanguard attacks. Kind of depends, but with this kind of being like the Hanali option, well, it never really counted for Hanali, so I guess it's fine. Next, we have our finishers. Favorite Champ Victor. Favorite Champ Victor is something that can just completely smash our opponent out of the game, but it's very kind of board and damage and hand reliant. If we have the hand and we have the damage, we have the board, great. Go into favorite champ, restand your board like 3-4 times. Why not? It's pretty good. Otherwise, more often than not, it's better just going into Drigger, the GB8, because, you know, usually at the point where you're going into Drigger, you have probably 2 Excel markers, you have 1, maybe 2 dose ledges, and maybe you've got like, you know, 2 to 3 restanders as well on the board, and you'll just swing at your opponent like, you know, 14 to 16 to 18 to, I think my record is 21 times. And a lot of those are going to be dose ledge swings. Of course, this only gets that much more deadly once we get Sazanda, because then every time something stands, it's getting a power buff. That being said though, I go into Drigger much more than I do favorite champ, and I have ended people's games with Drigger more often than not. This card's fantastic. I even considered running a second copy. I just couldn't really find the space for it, unfortunately. There's also a very, very fun and just dirty interaction you can do with Drigger and Kachiwal here, actually, especially since the once per turn ruling changed back in 2018, because Drigger gives something the skill that when it rests, it stands. So you can just choose to not proc Kachiwal on the first restand. And then when you go to swing with a column that has Kachiwal, you just swing with the front row card first, and then it will automatically restand. Then when you swing the second time, that's when you boost with the Kachiwal. The Kachiwal will immediately restand, and then you can stand something else in your front row to get just a ridiculous amount of attacks on a Trigger turn. Unless they hit the Overtrigger, there's no way anybody's surviving that. Okay, that does it for the strides now. Next, we'll talk about our G-Guards. I'm running 1 copy of Unior because on place, if you have no face-up damage, countercharge 2. Really good, and it's really easy to go into our opponent's turn with no face-up damage in this deck. And also, it's very easy to take a damage during our opponent's turn, use something like Baryon, counterblast that damage away, and then we're perfectly set up just to go into Unior, flip it, 2 things back. And he also has a skill that if we have no soul, we can soul charge 2 on place, and he gets 5k for each of those things that we do. It's fairly situational, so that's why I'm running it as a one of, but with the way you can kind of manipulate your damage in this deck during your opponent's turn, can be surprisingly relevant. Next, we have 2 copies of Meteor Kaiser Gundreed. Now, the reason I'm running 2 is basically just to potentially kind of turbo to GB8. You know, even if we go into a pretty lackluster Bustard turn, we could at least draw into some cards. If we have 2 heals, we can drop 2 of these and then go Trigger next turn and end our opponent's career. And also, he's just great to set up at the start of an opponent's big multi-attack turn. We're going to be blocking a lot and don't have a lot of damage, because every time after we guard with him, something attacks our Vanguard and doesn't hit, well, then we get to countercharge. That's pretty great. And then lastly, we have 2 copies of Meteor Kaiser Dogen Titan. If you happen to go up against Gerdora, please just start flipping these up with your flip skills, just because you will never be able to G-guard, and it's important to get him face up in G-zones, because then you can Soul Blast flip him down to flip up something that's locked, but that's not really relevant right now because Link Joker is not really relevant right now, even though my teammate played Chaos and we got the top 8. But it is relevant to basically just kind of make sure that you will have at least 1 damage going into your turn if your opponent decides to really aggressively damage deny you. And also, he's really good just because he's a 25k beat stick. When it comes to running something like Stiff Need, our new G guard that will be coming out here in a couple weeks, you know, potentially you run him over a copy of Gundreed or a copy of Unior. It really kind of depends. For the most part, the way this deck is, I feel like it's very plug and play friendly with the new stuff, and you can just kind of slot in 1 Stiff Need and you can slot in 1 or 2 Merciless Dragons, and you're sitting pretty. And then other than that, like I said earlier too, once Hazanda comes out, he's probably taking the place of Dosledge. Okay. Wow. I have talked a lot about Nova Grappler. A lot of this stuff has been kicking around in my head for a while, just because I've been playing this deck and tuning and fine-tuning and just doing so much just with this deck for basically the last 6 months since BRO happened, honestly. I feel like Victor is in a solid position. I feel like it's a solid, I guess, like tier 2. If you want to be generous, you could call it tier 1.5, but definitely a rogue pick, because, you know, it's so funny to me. I can't tell you how many times I flip up Nova Grappler and then my opponent just doesn't know what my cards do, and then because of that in itself is its own advantage, and so for that reason, you know, I'm kind of happy with Nova Grappler's rogue status, because it kind of makes it easy to steal wins. That being said though, if you do build Victor, I feel like this should ideally be a very good starting place for you, and this is my favorite deck. This is the deck I've been maining since 2015. Granted, you know, I play every Nova Grappler build, but Victor has been the boy since he came out for me. I would like to play some premium heroes. Please, Bushiroad Premium Collection 2023. Can I have a Spinning Valiant Stride and a Girly Dolly G-Guard? I would really, really like that. Just a thought. But other than that, if you have any thoughts or questions of your own, you know, please feel free to sound off below, and I will try to get to as many of them as I can. Other than that, follow me on other things. Twitch. We go live on Twitch pretty regularly, and we just kind of chat and have a good time. And occasionally we play Monster Hunter, sometimes with some other people in the Vanguard community that you might know. But I think that's about it for me though. I'm not sure how long this video is going to be in the edit, but I've been sitting here for literally almost an hour. So I'm going to go. Yeah, take it easy. Till next time.